One of the most exciting things I've done in the business is when we built one of those modules in our yard and we brought a 40-ton crane out and we lifted this module, which was taller than the factory, right, up in the car park, right, to make sure it lifted. And as that module came up, and I was eyeballing it along the length of that 14 meters and it didn't flex a millimeter, I mean, that was super exciting, right? That was really, really cool.
Peter, welcome to the first episode of Steel Framing Connections. For those that don't know you, do you want to just introduce who you are and a bit about your business?
Sure. So my name is Peter Blythe. I founded Dynamic Steel Frame with my business partner, Jeff, about 13 years ago, after already being in the steel framing industry for about 6 years prior to that. We started the business with one roll former, a second-hand roll former we bought at auction before the big surge in the popularity of light gauge in Australia. And since then, since that first machine, which has now just ticked over 5 million meters, which is a big achievement for a machine like that, we now have 8 frame CAD roll formers from 140 down to 75 mil wide, and a large deep sea machine that does our floor system and hyper chassis. So yeah, we've grown exponentially year on year. We were doing 40 to 60% growth year on year for a long time. That's kind of flattening out now because we're at the limits of our factory, but the sky's the limit still.
In Australia, like what's the kind of market share there at the moment?
So it's quite it's varied state to state. So obviously Australia is a really, really big place, and we're only populated around the very outside for the most part of the country. So on a state to state basis, Victoria is probably amongst the lowest, in fact, at around we'd say 8%, 9% steel framing. For a long time, it was about 3%, when the biggest fabricator in the state had their own, well, they had their own building company that had its own steel framing plant, and they made up about 3% of the market of house build. So naturally, steel framing was about 3% of the market in Victoria. Since then we've grown in the last since we started the business. The Victorian market has exploded. Then you have markets like South Australia where it's more like 30%. New South Wales is probably 12 to 15. Queensland's probably up around that 25 to 30. And then in WA, as you go further north into the cyclonic regions, it gets to a higher and higher percentage of steel framing. But nationally, if you average out the builds, probably 15% is steel frame. And that's mainly because Victoria has such a huge share of the construction market, where they're still the biggest construction market in the country. So yeah, that's why it's around the 15% nationally.
What's driving that change, and is the growth going to continue?
So the change has been quite organic, right? So I'll use the focus of dynamic steel frame as a reference point. When we started, there was very few people manufacturing steel frame in Victoria. There was a lot of people buying material from that large fabricator and then turning it into steel frames. And then when we started with the automated technology, a lot of kernels of growth started then. So it started for us very organically with some commercial builds where we were replacing structural steel and purlin and a plaster stud style construction with a load-bearing light gauge steel design, right? So we were converting those commercial style builds into more of a domestic style build with, roof trusses that sat on top of wall frames, rather than structural steel holding up purlins and underneath that, non-load bearing wall frames underneath. And slowly as we grew and that market became really, really ripe for steel framing, it was a huge cost saving and a time saving for the builder. And then slowly as that grew, then various other parts of the market started to jump on to steel framing, as well as naturally some of the industries where we'd taken away that market share, where let's say it was the structural steel, those structural steel businesses started to look at what we were doing and say, hey, if we still want part of this market, we better buy the same roll formers. And it was similar with facades. So when we started organically producing facades for customers who always use traditional, what we call stick built, getting purlins and battens and things and creating prefabricated facades, we happened upon a customer who did a lot of that kind of work and they really gravitated very quickly to the automated roll-formed version of prefabricated facades, and that's when a number of businesses also got into, frame CAD roll formers for that kind of construction, and that naturally just grew. And as the professors say, the early adopters enjoy a disproportionate advantage over the rest of the market. We were first to do all of those things, and that has grown up, around the dynamic steel frame, beacon, I guess you'd call it. And so then more recently, during, the great COVID material shortage where everyone ran out of wood and everyone decided, well, steel framing was the way to do it. I can't tell you how many businesses started up to do steel framing as a reactionary response. Not many of those businesses around, but the ones who were doing it for the right reasons have stayed in the market, and that's helping to grow the market as well as the quality of competing building technologies is going down. Wood's not what it used to be. It's young, it's knotted, it's moist, it moves all over the place. There's plenty of photos of studs being made that are just bananas, and people are actually starting to realize that that's not the future. And you top that with steel always coming from a BIM perspective. We always design things on screen first and make sure it works, and then we go and manufacture. Whereas the old building technologies have been, we build whatever we can on site, and then everyone comes and modifies the frame to suit their requirements. And that's slow. It involves changes. It involves a whole bunch of re-engineering, and just, it's not the right way to build. The skill to do that, as traditional chippies and carpenters, there's not as many. Everyone is focusing on very small parts of the market. It's fragmenting. It's the skill in being able to do everything in a house, which a chippy or a builder used to be able to do, is going. So the market really needs that design first, make it work on screen, and then go and execute on site.
So the quality aspect is huge, but is the cost between like a timber and a light gauge steel comparable in your market?
It certainly is. So it used to be, when we first started the business, we were competing with, it was always more expensive, right? Steel was always more expensive because, let's say it's 30% more expensive, right, than a stick-built timber frame, right? So we were competing with stick-built timber, which is the cheapest way to build a house. It's certainly not the best way, but it's certainly the most inexpensive from a dollar perspective way. As the industry's progressed, and again, less people are able to stick build a good house, and builders want, a frame up very quickly, and they want to do that design on screen first. We're competing with prefabricated timber versus prefabricated steel, and those prices are significantly closer, right? The market that dynamic steel frame has been really strong in for the last, I don't know, 6 or 7 years, has been the townhouse sector. When we're talking about a stick-built or a single-story house in a growth area, a lot of builders still like to use timber there because the trades are on site, they're available, they can go, a contract and a slab down and a frame up within 2 weeks. It's a very, very fast process, and often there's no time to do the prefabrication, the pre-engineering, all the optimization. It's just the customer's given us a deposit, go at it, right? But when we look at the townhouse market and the 2-story, 3-story, 4-story market, once we get above 2 stories, steel is a far more cost-effective solution for a builder, to the point where we don't really compete with timber in those kind of builds anymore. We're competing against other steel frame fabricators. We're not in, people have realized that once you go 3 stories and 4 stories, timber doesn't stack up. It's too heavy. There's too much structure goes into the ground floor. And when you reduce the weight by 50 or 60%, you get to make a lot of efficiencies in the materials you use on the ground level. And it just doesn't even stack up against, or timber doesn't stack up against steel anymore, if you pardon the pun.
Yeah. Where's your focus? Like, mostly you got your like residential, commercial. Where is most of your growth and focus at the moment?
So we work across every sector, right? From tiny houses through to multi-story apartments and everything in between. We've done it all. We probably did it before anybody else in terms of, for instance, tiny houses. When it was just myself in a factory with a roll former and maybe one team member, one of our very first projects was building a tiny house. And no one had built a tiny house in Australia in light gauge steel before. And then we went on to build, I don't know, scores and scores and scores of tiny houses over the years. So everything from the most basic of residential construction through to the highly complicated 4-story light gauge load bearing structure that has to integrate acoustics and fire and all kind of dynamics. We've done it all, right? The focus at the moment in the industry really is either MMC, right? So there's a lot of focus on MMC. Our hyperspan chassis is just unbelievably good for people who want to build modular and want to get away from having to weld chassis in a factory. We can build a chassis in about 2 hours, which is 12 meters long, 4.5 meters wide. In 2 hours, you're able to start doing the plumbing inside the floor or putting floor down, and that's just unbeatable. You just can't beat that. So the focus at the moment is that MMC space. And townhouses. Townhouses are always going to be great for steel framing because of the repeatability and because of the material quality. So you don't get, a wall that's waving as it goes up 3 stories because the material's got a bow in it. Every stud's a good stud, and you get a straight wall that goes up. And even if it rains for 3 weeks and it's hot and it's cold and it's wet and it's dry, the material doesn't change. Whereas other building technologies like wood will change. You will have to straighten them. You will have to batten them. They will move. And so when you're a commercial builder, and I call townhouse construction more of a commercial style build than a residential build, time is money, right? The builder is on LDs. They have to get slabs down. They have to get frames in. They've got an enormous project. It's a 30 or 40 or $50 million project, and every single day counts. They can't be waiting around while things dry out, and they can't be waiting around to pack and plane and straighten walls to make it work, right? In a domestic, I'm off on a bit of a tangent here, but when it's a domestic single story build and the builders have got 6 to 12 months to build and they're not funding the build, the bank is, time is not really of the essence, right? Money is. And if you can save $100 on a frame, a big builder will, because they're not worried about time as much as a commercial builder who's got a crane on site that costs $10,000 a day to have there. You've got a 100-unit townhouse site that's got 4 site managers and all these crews on it. Every day counts. And that's where steel is just unbeatable in terms of efficiencies on site. And so that's where we're focusing. It's townhouse, it's modular, and anything that requires speed.
In your opinion, how would we get more steel frame adopted? Like, how do we kind of eat into that timber market share? What do we need to do?
What do we need to do as an industry?
Yeah.
It's a good question. There's a lot of stuff the industry is doing at the moment in terms of engineering and optimizing engineering and making sign-offs faster and easier. One thing that the timber industry does have is that self-certified truss software, which I'm not sure how long that's going to last, especially on larger projects over 2 stories where everything has to be certified anyway. So that kind of advantage is leaving the timber industry, especially in the markets that we're very strong. But what can we do more? I think it's more adoption early, and it's more education of architects, engineers, and builders about what's possible and what we're capable of in steel, right? We've done things in steel framing that nobody in the world has ever done. We've done facades that are, 14 meters tall, 8 meters wide, and 2 meters deep, and have 2,500 linear meters of frame in each one, which is, made horizontally on the ground, clad, and then lifted up, tilted, and put on a building. And no one thought that was possible. I didn't think it was possible. When someone said, "Hey, can we do this?" We went, don't know. And then, granted industry cladding and roofing and we put our heads together and we made it work. That kind of, bleeding edge kind of stuff where you don't know whether it's even possible, but you go out and you make it work. Working with those kinds of people is critical to saying, this is what we can do as an industry and as a technology and as a material and as a team to push that boundary. And that's what dynamic steel frame has tried to do always. We always have what we like to call a hero project going at any one time. Sometimes it's a, massive curved facade. Sometimes it's 18 of those 14-meter tall facades going, or it's a massive townhouse project, or it's it's a multi-story build that requires fire rating from level to level. That's really complicated stuff to get right. some of those projects certainly have not been profitable, but they've been boundary pushing. So if I look at say the big facade project, if anybody wants to look it up, it's the Morwell facade project. It's all over our our socials and YouTube and whatever else. I'm sure you can put a link to it or something later. That project, looking back at how we did it, the amount of time it took to engineer, to model, to freight, to assemble on site versus the $750,000 we saved the builder on scaffolding and the 3 months that we saved them on build time, we were probably half the price we should have been. Not from a trying to exploit the project per se, but when we look back at how much time went into getting it right, obviously we grossly underestimated how much time it was going to take because it was a groundbreaking project. But the value it gave to the builder wasn't harnessed by dynamic steel frame as a business. Next time, that would have been double the cost, and it still would have saved the builder hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars and still months on site. So, those groundbreaking projects, not always profitable on the first one, but we have the volume in the business to be able to do a project like that that we don't necessarily make money on, and sometimes we'll lose money. But the next time we know how to do it, and we know how to do it well. And that's what we've been able
Yeah.
to enjoy during this huge uplift in steel framing, is we've been at the top of that crest of that wave where we've been able to do those projects and make the mistakes on the first ones to make them better on the second ones.
And I think, like, if I look at what you guys are doing, that kind of design led kind of approach and that kind of continuous improvement, how important is that, that design and engineering up front for you guys?
Oh, it's critical. It's absolutely critical. There's a couple of things I like to say. It's no decisions on site, right? Because we work with the process is we sell it to the business owner, for instance. He hands it down to his project manager or his construction manager. We have a whole bunch of conversations and decisions that are made during that design process. And then that guy hands it over to the site manager, who often has had absolutely nothing to do with the design, right? So we like to get it to a point where that site manager doesn't have to make any decisions about how it goes together. It just goes up, right? So that's the no decisions on site policy. There should be no ambiguity in the design. And so the design, the engineering, the detailing, and the scheduling needs to be on point so that when things arrive, they go up. And then, day one, the walls go up. Day two, the joists go on. Day three, the next walls go on. Day four, the roof trusses go on in that kind of cadence. And that pre-engineering and pre-design is critical. This is not a built kind of technology. This is a prefabbed, has to be right before it gets to site to harness the benefits of it.
Does that sometimes cause objections though? Like if the builders are used to being able to just get a drop saw and make, like, how do you
Always
counter that? Like, how is it like you need to earn trust? Like, do it right.
Yeah.
Let me show you.
Yeah. So one of the things when we're talking to a new client who's looking at adopting, or maybe the owner of the house has said to their builder, I want to use steel. I always tell the builder, you're going to hate the first time, right? We're going to ask you, I don't know, 100 questions more than you've ever been asked by any manufacturer before about your build. And you're going to hate it. You're not going to understand why we ask the questions. You're going to say, well, this is just how we've always done it, et cetera, et cetera. But through that process, the education piece around that, and then, the way that, well, as soon as that builder who's never seen, our model and our 3D and what we can do with it before, soon as they see their frame on screen, often you see something just click in their head and they go, this is what you mean. This is why you need to know this. This is why you need to know that. And it's always an education piece. People don't know what they don't know. And we try to teach them everything we know about prefabrication to make sure that when we go, hey, look, this window isn't working. What do you want to do? What would you do on site if it was timber, for instance? What would you do on site to fix this? And he'd say, well, I'd do this, this, and this. And we say, well, why don't we just put that in your frame now, right? And then that becomes a collaboration, and the builder then can control the process of exactly how he wants it to look, right? Each builder has a slightly different way of doing things, and each builder has slightly different tolerances they want to be built into their frame, and tolerances around windows and different cladding and flashing and all those little bits and pieces. And once they kind of understand that they can have millimeter precision on an opening, then they start actually to get really excited about it, right? Because as a builder, if you're not putting the frame up, and these days the builder is not a framer. It used to be that the builder was the carpenter installed the frames and the windows and the cladding and everything else. That's gone. The builder is now a project manager, with respect, obviously, to builders. But when they start to realize that they want that opening to be 1047.5 open for all the detail they want in it, once they realize that that is precisely what they'll get on site, not 1047 minus, right, on site, because of the material might have a bow in it and whatever else, there's no more plus or minus. It's you get precisely what you want, and then they can control the quality and they can control all the connections so much better using this technology than they've ever been able to. I like to use the story of one of our biggest builders that we work with. Before we started with this builder, before this builder started to work with us, I'd work with a developer for approximately 2 years leading into the project, right? So they came to us 2 years prior and they said, "Hey, Pete, we want to use steel framing. We like what you're doing. We'll use dynamic steel frame." And the builder who wins the project will use dynamic. It's sort of like it'll be locked in. And we started working on the design very early on, making sure walls lined up from a load-bearing perspective, making sure we had enough room around windows for portal frames and whatever else. And that particular builder was, honestly, they were dragged kicking and screaming into steel framing, right? Um, Since then, they're now one of the biggest steel frame users certainly in Victoria. They build probably more townhouses than anybody else in Victoria, but their very first experience was honestly kicking and screaming, right? They didn't want to do it. They wanted to stick with their traditional timber techniques, and it only took them 54 townhouses on one site to realize this is the future, right? And since then, they've done some other projects in timber, but the vast majority, 95% of their work has been in steel, and they're now at the forefront of building townhouses in steel framing. It just takes one good project where people start to look at it and go, now I understand, now I get it. The design process, the engineering process, the optimization process, and then the absolute quality and straightness of the final frame, everything comes together into just building precision into a job.
How important is the technology, your process and what you guys deliver?
So technology from a software perspective. So obviously we're a FrameCAD fabricator, right? So we use FrameCAD Nexa from the machinery control perspective. We use FrameCAD Steelwise, and we used to use Structure and FrameCAD Detailer and FrameCAD everything. And that hand-in-glove approach, software to machinery, is really important because there's no ambiguity of file from one software to the other. And when I say one software to the other, I mean the design software to the roll forming software, right? They are basically the same thing. We know that whatever we see on screen, is precisely what will come out of the roll former, to the point where, if our guys upstairs draw it incorrectly, it just won't be manufacturable. There's certain connection details that don't quite work in a factory. If they draw it wrong, it'll come out wrong. But that doesn't happen anymore. It used to happen a little bit, not much anymore. But that hand in glove approach between the design software and the roll forming is really important, and the accuracy of the machinery is obviously critical, right? We're plus or minus 0.1, 0.2 from operation to operation on a roll former. So, a wall frame's plus or minus 1 mil, right? That's almost unheard of in construction, and that's actually one of the early pushbacks from builders has been, this is too accurate sometimes, right? I know that sounds silly, but it's too accurate. We're used to doing heaps of packing, and we're used to doing this, and we're used to doing that, and we don't realize what we can do. And again, that's that education piece where once they understand what they're working with, they can really harness that technology. So technology is
And I
absolutely
guess,
critical.
yeah, and that accuracy must really kind of help the assembly as well, like what you guys are doing in the factory and on the building site, right?
Yeah, 100%. So we know that if it works on screen, it's going to work in the factory. So there's no transposition errors, I guess you'd call it, between one design software and some random roll former out of whatever country. It's one system, and it works. And that for us is critical. We don't have to worry about that relationship. We don't have to worry about trying to manipulate a file or a roll former to do what we want it to do. If it works on screen, it works on the roll former. It's simple. And that simplicity is really important.
So how long have you been doing this for?
13 years.
11 years? 13 years?
13
Okay.
years, yep.
So
13 years, December 19th was our day we moved into our first factory. 13 years, yep.
So if today's Peter could go back to 13 years ago, Peter, and you're starting up, what advice would you give yourself?
That's a really good question.
Knowing what you know now.
It's a good question. From a manufacturing perspective, I've had one of the best guys in the world on our manufacturing for the last 11 years. Some of the stuff that we've done as a business, we couldn't do without a number of really critical people, right? So finding the right people is so important, right? As they always say, you think it's expensive to hire the right person, wait until you hire the wrong one. And we've been fortunate enough that we've hired and employed and partnered with really, really good people all the time. I've always been very, very customer centric. Our customers are our best friends. We have to work together. We haven't been adversarial, so I'd recommend never being adversarial. I don't know we've made too many mistakes along the way. The mistakes have been small, and we've been able to overcome any of those very quickly. We never financed a machine. We just bought what we could afford. So I don't know whether we can change anything from that business perspective. But I think contractually with builders is a really important thing. We've been burnt a few times by builders who, will hide clauses in a contract and they're not really acting in good faith a few times. But other than that, I think as a business, we've done reasonably well. There's not too many things I could go back and say, hey, that was a real stuff up. Don't do that. We've had, admittedly a fairly clean run. And I think that's just because we were the first or one of the first, I should say, to do it. And we were able to ride that wave up to where we are now. So, I know it's work hard, own a business.
Yeah.
They said it'll be fun. They said, right?
Yeah. Have you got a project that comes top of mind that you're most proud of?
Yeah, look, there's a few actually. So our first, and to the best of my knowledge, only 4-story light gauge steel building in Australia was really good. We did that a long time ago, very early on in the business. Right? It was not like we did it last week. We did it when no one had ever done it before. No one knew how to do it, and we went and figured it out. And we installed about 3,000 square meters across 4 stories in, I think it was 11 or 12 weeks, ready for a roof. And no one had ever built that way before. So we had to invent all kinds of technology, invent all kinds of connections and methods on site in order to do it. And, stud specifications and back to back here and not back to back there and all that kind of stuff. So that was a really good one. We did that Chesterville Road in Keysborough, somewhere. Chesterville Road, anyway. It was a 4-story build. And that was probably 9 years ago, right? 9 or 10 years ago. That was really great. And we won awards for that, right? Then the massive facade we did with Granted Industry Cladding and Roofing, where it was the 18 facades that are, 14.5 meters tall, 8.5 meters wide, 2.5 meters deep. That was awesome, right? That was during the height of COVID. It was a really, really enjoyable project. Everyone got to get their teeth stuck into it. Everyone had a good time. And probably one of the most exciting things I've done in the business is when we built one of those modules in our yard and we brought a 40-ton crane out and we lifted this module, which was taller than the factory, right, up in the car park, right, to make sure it lifted. And as that module came up, and I was eyeballing it along the length of that 14 meters and it didn't flex a millimeter, I mean, that was super exciting, right? That was really, really cool. And then the first, the townhouse project that we did, the 54 with a builder, that was great as well because that was a real, I don't want to use the word vindication. It's not a fair word, but it was a real, what's the word? It was just it was a culmination of years and years and years of pushing into this market. We'd done 2 years of work with a developer previously. Shout out to Paul and Jeff on that. That lead up and then actually being able to execute it and the builder being, really delighted with what they got. That was, that's unreal. That's great stuff. That is. That makes you want to come to work, right?
It's awesome.
Yeah, and as it turns out, there's a funny story attached to that. Um, my nana, who died at 104 a couple of years ago, bless her soul, I was talking to her when I think she was 99 about this particular project, and it was on Stewart Street in Brunswick, and she said, "Oh, was that an old wool dyeing factory?" And I said, "Yeah, it's called Flock Mill because it's a flock mill." And she said, I think my grandfather worked there. And it turns out my nana, who, was 104, born in 1914, the day the war ended. So her name was Beryl Peace Taylor because she was born on Armistice Day. Either her father or her grandfather worked on that site. And 100 years later, we were building townhouses on it. And that's just, you just go, wow,
Wow.
universe,
Yeah.
well done. Thank you.
Wow. Yeah, that's crazy. And just recently, well, maybe last year or the year before, Bunnings kind of acquired. And
Yep.
for those that don't know, Bunnings is like a Home Depot equivalent in the US. Does that kind of show where steel framing's got to in terms of market adoption, and
Look,
what does that mean?
It really does. It really does. So Bunnings came to us, and there was a 2-year courting process, and it was a lot of fun. But Bunnings actually have 6 timber frame and truss plants. What a lot of people don't realise about Bunnings is that they actually have the manufacturing capability in timber, and they just spent, I think it was $70 million on building 3 new timber frame and truss plants in Truganina, in Minto, and in Wacol. And in each of those facilities, they've earmarked about 1,000 square meters for steel frame manufacturing. And they did that realizing that obviously in the washout from COVID, right, and the material shortages, that timber is going to become harder and harder to acquire, right? Australia is a net importer of timber. We import 40% of the construction timber that we use in this country, and that's growing and growing. And steel is not, other than the great material shortage of 2022, steel is not scarce. We can just ramp up and ramp down, make more as required. It doesn't take 20 years to grow, and the quality of the product is always absolute. It's an inorganic, engineered product, right? So Bunnings looked at that and said, well, look, as steel framing is getting more and more popular, we need a presence in steel framing. And they spent, like I said, it was a 2-year courting process where they went and spoke to just about every steel frame fabricator up the East Coast, and settled on Dynamic Steel Frame as as that beacon, the leading edge of steel framing in Victoria and the country. And that's why they chose us to acquire. So we've been wholly acquired. We operate under the Bunnings ABN, but we operate as inside what they call the special businesses part of the business. So we are I won't say standalone, but we are a manufacturing facility in our own right here. And off we go. And the idea there is that builders want to be able to use timber or steel in some instances. Sometimes they only want to use wood. Sometimes they only want to use steel. And Bunnings can offer both. And obviously the idea is to expand into each state and have facilities in each state eventually.
Are the consumers asking for steel framing? I know you guys were on the block several years now. Is
Just
it
on our
is
eighth,
it the
I think it's
consumer?
our 8th year this year. Yeah.
So are consumers becoming more aware and asking for steel framing,
Yep.
or is it still mainly at the building?
No, so we don't do a lot of detached residential, right? When we do detached residential or housing, it's generally really high-end stuff, right? So we've got a couple of businesses that do super high-end builds. So Elation Homes is one of them. Shout out to the team there. They've really adopted steel framing in every part of their business. They know that coming to us 3 months before you want to be on site is better than coming to us 6 weeks before you want to get on site, because we can iron out all those bugs, right? So they, as a high-end builder, they demand it, right? We have other builders very similar. They want the quality, they want the straight walls, they want that prefabricated speed and efficiency. But also, very often, we will have worked for a commercial builder doing a townhouse project or an apartment building or a warehouse or whatever. The owner of the builder comes to us and says, I want to build my house and I want to use steel. So they see the quality, right? And they understand why steel is better than wood. And a lot of commercial builders are happy with steel. They understand steel. So again, we come back to that education piece about growing the market. It's an education about how steel works. We often will have the builder and the owner, if it's a custom build, will come to the office and go through the design together. And that's where that comes from. It's, if we want the general public to ask for steel framing, that's where sort of our relationship with TrueCore comes in, where they're advertising on TV, they're sponsoring the block, they're trying to or they're bringing through that pull through advertising where people will ask for steel, but they'll ask for steel with the big project home builders. So it's about trying to draw that through the project home builder as well, where that adoption will grow. And there are some large project home builders, national project home builders, who do now ask for steel and come via us for their steel frames. They're still very fledgling at the moment, I would call it, in that space, but that's not going to be fledgling for long. There's some real big moves happening at the moment where those big builders will just offer steel or wood. You can make the choice. There's very little price difference often between timber and steel, and so that wave will start to come over the shore in the project home builders.
Awesome. Well, thank you for joining today and
Pleasure.
for your knowledge. Where can people find you if they want to have a look at your projects and have a look at what you guys have been doing?
Yep. So we're really active on Facebook, LinkedIn, Instagram, YouTube. We try to fly our drone on as many of our projects as we possibly can. There's hundreds of videos on YouTube. We post 3 days a week on Instagram. There's a heap of product, and it's all just dynamic steel frame. Look us up. We're everywhere.
Great. Well, thank you, and thank you everyone for listening to our first episode, and we'll see you in the next one.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks for listening to Steel Framing Connections. If today's conversation sparked a new idea, share it with your team and subscribe so you don't miss what's next. To explore the technology, people and projects shaping the future of steel framing, visit framecad.com. Let's reframe how you think about building.